Today we're going to do a cooking video in honor of Henry Morgan's raid on Panama. So, first thing we need to add is an ammo pouch. I mean, it's got some hair on it. We can shave the hair off later. A nicer shoe. We're going to take the nails out at some point. And to top it all off and add a little bit of flavor, a Buccaneer shoe. Let me get the salt real quick. Okay, here we go. We got the salt. Probably going to heat these up, maybe soak them for a little bit. But, yeah, I think that'll be good. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Today we are going to go over some of the images created by French engineers and cartographers in the late 1680s. These are eyewitness images to what Buccaneers and Filibusters were wearing at the time. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on what we know about some of the earlier Buccaneers, but we're going to focus mainly on the actual images. These are an excellent source for those of us studying the time period. They aren't cherry-picked. They're not like some of the other art that, oh, we got to find the nicest looking person. Oh, we have to find the most ragged looking person. No, these are images that the French cartographers drew while they were among the Buccaneers and Filibusters. These are in the possession of the French National Museum. I'm not going to try to pronounce it in French because I'm terrible with French. Let's begin. Let's put this time period of these drawings into context. Henry Morgan had already been involved in the crackdown against pirates. The Buccaneer age was coming to an end, but within a few years, you start seeing the rise of Red Sea piracy. A lot of these Buccaneers in these images are holdovers. That said, the French and the Dutch, to a certain extent, still continued to employ Buccaneers. Filibusters and Buccaneers, although they are often used interchangeably, they were, at times, very different. Buccaneers tend to be applied to the English, and Filibusters tend to be applied to the French. That said, they worked together. They had a lot of crossover. So I might mention something is listed as a Filibuster, or I might mention it's listed as Buccaneer. I'll give details as I go. In the beginning, many of the Buccaneers had served in Cromwell's New Model Army. There's a very good chance that, well, we know that some of them were wearing their old uniforms from the New Model Army, patching them together, trying to keep them around. Eventually those would wear out. And we start seeing a much more rugged, less military image of the Buccaneers. This is one of my favorite images, largely because people often overthink what they're seeing. So if you notice, he's wearing a longish sleeve waistcoat, much like the gray one that I sometimes wear in the videos. He's got a small pistol in his right pocket and a larger pistol in his belt. It's important to note how thin the belt is. A lot of times when we think of pirates, we think of these massive belt buckles. No, belts in this time period were very thin. I mean, that's probably about an inch, inch and a half at most. It's practical. It's not designed to carry a lot of equipment. It's also not designed to hold up your pants. It is just for a small amount of equipment basically to free up your hands. The pouch, if you notice, seems to be very flat. We're going to get into this with some other images later. This is most likely a homemade pouch. This is something that would have been made in the field. Doesn't require much skill. It's just basically folding leather, stitching it together, having some attachment, done. Would this have been made from hair on hide? We cannot be sure. There's not enough detail in the image to say either way. It's almost certainly made from a poorer leather, given that, again, it's something that was most likely made in the field. Now, there are many different ways to tan leather in this time period. I will not do a video myself on it, but I might do an interview at a later date with people who have a lot more experience working with leather. Right above that belt is what a lot of people, when they first look at it, will interpret as a sash. That is most likely a mosquito net. Mosquito nets were used in this time period. They might not have known that mosquitoes were carrying some of the diseases, but they knew they were very uncomfortable sleeping at night with mosquitoes biting them. If anybody's ever tried to sleep in an area with a lot of mosquitoes, it's awful. These would often be staked up above the body. You don't want it laying against the body because a mosquito can still bite you. Staked up against the body so they can't get in. Staked up above the body so they can't get in. And have a fairly nice sleep. These would not have been made like a net. They would have most likely been woven. It would have been a loosely woven material, probably hemp, linen, something like that. If you notice, the pistol in his pocket is a smaller pistol. It is most likely of the sort that we would call a Queen Anne pistol. Queen Anne pistols, although they're called Queen Anne pistols, they started coming out in the 1670s and 80s. They didn't really become popular overall until the reign of Queen Anne, hence the name. The sword is very interesting. It is very likely a hunting sword. Hunting swords were very popular in the colonies well into the early 19th century. One of George Washington's swords famously is a hunting sword. It's probably, the hilt looks very ornate. It's tough to see what exactly the detail is, but there are plenty of ornate examples at the time. The reason I say a hunting sword is, judging by the shape of it, these tended to be a single-edged weapon. They're also more of a tool. I know some commentators on YouTube, oh, it's just used for dispatching an animal. No, you can, some of them you could use as a machete. Some weren't necessarily the best at that, but quite a few of them were of a thicker blade that could be used as a tool if needed. The breeches are interesting because these are a closed knee. They're closed knee breeches. They're a little bit tighter than what we think of with much of the 17th century. This style was starting to become popular right around this time. It's tough to tell if he's wearing stockings or not. But what's very interesting are his shoes. Again, we're going to have other images to contrast this with. These are most likely what we think of as Buccaneer shoes. These shoes would have been, again, I know I've said it before, these were made from the back leg of a boar. They would have, the leather would have been left pretty much raw. The foot would have been slipped in, and they would have been laced closed. Gives them a very distinctive shape. What's interesting is in his hand, he's carrying what appears to be a paper cartridge. Buccaneers, even though they were hunters, when we think of hunters, especially in a northeastern American context, we think of the powder horn, properly patching everything. Buccaneers made great use of paper cartridges. Now, this is where the interpretation starts to get interesting, because Some people view him as wearing a separate coat, a separate jacket on top of his waistcoat. That was a thing that was done in the time period. However, if you notice, he actually appears to be wearing something on his back. That is a strap. It wouldn't necessarily be for a backpack. Most likely something would have been rolled or bundled up, and the straps would have been added to it to help him carry it, whatever is back there. In some of the other images, you start to see that some of them are actually carrying fur from, or carrying hide from, likely wild cattle. As you can tell, the musket he's carrying is fairly long. It's roughly about the size of what we think of as a Fowler. It's a Buccaneer gun. It's pretty much the dictionary image of what one would look like. In some of the pictures, the butts of the guns do not seem to be that well developed. This is an example of that. Was it a crudely made weapon, or was it just the artist not getting the line right? It's tough to say. Given the detail he put in other parts, but then you look at some of the pistols, he wasn't putting that much detail in the weapons. If you notice, the hair is not that long. It's long-ish, but it's not shoulder length. Yes, I know, I wear my hair shoulder length. The hat is a very simple hat with it's folded up in the front. We're going to see some other examples of different sorts of headwear, but this is pretty much a typical, given some of the clothing he's wearing, possibly fresh out of Port Royal, Buccaneer. Now this one, we're going to start from the hat, since we were already talking about hats. There's a practice that appears in several images. There's also, I believe, a surviving example from slightly later of hats that were actually, they'd cut most of the brim off, and it would be left with we think of it as almost a cartoonish, like a baseball cap. This, to them, would not be cartoonish. It would just be a very practical hat that you could fold the front down to keep the sun out of your eyes, but it's not getting in the way when it comes to brush, walking through undergrowth, things like that. If you notice, it is a very short jacket that he's wearing. The cuffs seem to be folded over a little bit. You can see the shirt, you can see the very edge of it. It's actually a very nice shirt. Around his neck, he's wearing what you'd call later a cravat. If you notice, the neckline is very crude. So he's mixing this rugged, possibly something he himself made in the field jacket with a very nice shirt. Now, we know that the Buccaneers did take what's been described as either sackcloth or sailcloth and made jackets with it, sometimes dyed blue. Could this be one of them? It's tough to say, but it shows a fairly crude short jacket. It's also hard to tell how many buttons he has, but it would have come down to roughly the waist. Again, we got a small belt. Now, I mentioned the pouches earlier and that we would have something to compare them to. This is the type of pouch he's wearing here is what we see in some of the excavations from the Phipps and the Witta sites. This is a cartridge box that would have likely had a wooden lining inside of it. It's tough to say how the front would close. There's several examples of closures at this time, so this is a very developed cartridge box. This likely wouldn't be something homemade. This would have been something that would have been an issued item to, whether it be merchants, the military. In this case, he's wearing petticoat breeches. Now, I keep looking at these because later petticoat breeches were worn when you talk about late 18th century, what people call slops, erroneously. They were worn over other breeches. Looking at these, I keep wondering if that's breeches or if those are his stockings. Stockings at this time tend to be fairly high up, and they were often tied off about the knee. So, to me, he's wearing stockings. Others might interpret that as breeches. It's tough to tell. Looking at other images from this specific time period, the style of wearing other breeches underneath was not really in vogue. And he is wearing what we call open latchet shoes. These are not Buccaneer shoes. These are, again, these would have been shoes that he would have likely bought, probably in Port Royal, might have captured them. I should also return to his hair. Notice his hair is actually longer. It's coming down past his shoulders. He also has a feather in his hat from the looks of it. He probably would have been a very interesting character to meet in person. He also has a little mustache. Facial hair in these images tends to be a little bit rare, but when we're talking about the 17th century, we still have some of the holdovers from the earlier part of the 17th century where you have the really fancy facial hair. This was starting to go out of fashion at this time. We're starting to get the clean-shaven look, which would continue throughout the 18th century. It's tough to see his sword. It looks like he's almost wearing it without a scabbard or a sheath, and it appears to have a clipped point. Swords like this did exist. Why he's wearing it without that could be the artist, could be him. It's tough to say. And again, we have a very nice example of a Buccaneer gun. If you notice, the artist did some attempts to add little designs on it to show that it was a nicely made, decorated piece. These two are specifically labeled as filibusters, meaning they were most likely French. If you notice, both of them are wearing properly made cartridge boxes. Their jackets are also slightly longer, and they both have swords, which one of them has it unsheathed. Judging by the shape of the guard and the shape of the blade, again, it's most likely a hunting sword. It's tough to tell the one guy's hat, but the other guy's definitely wearing a very decorated, what we would think of today as the quintessential Buccaneer hat. Very cavalier in appearance, with a feather, broad brim. They're also both wearing very nice shoes. The one with the hat, his heel appears to be like the really higher heel, possibly upper class. They're both wearing petticoat breeches again, and seems to be no line showing breeches underneath. The more distorted image it's tough to tell. Definitely the guy wearing the nice hat, he's not wearing anything underneath, so these were just regular breeches, but with an open knee. And if you notice, the more distorted figure has a Buccaneer gun once again. And here we have a Buccaneer actually stretching a hide to let it dry. Again, I want to do an interview with people who do tanning so that they can teach a lot better than I can how this process works. A lot of them will hang hides to dry. In this case, he's staking it to the ground. Again, we have the short jacket, very short jacket. We have the Buccaneer hat. He's got very long hair. It almost looks like he has very fancy sideburns, but again, it's probably the locks of his hair. The fancy sideburns weren't really a thing at this time, no matter what certain series on pirates might want to tell you. On his belt, you can see a knife set. This style was very popular in Dutch paintings. It was likely fairly universal at this time in Europe. Todd's workshop, if any of you follow Todd, he actually has a set. His is dated earlier, but it's a very similar style to what would have been used at this time. Again, we got the open-kneed breeches, and we got Buccaneer shoes again. It's tough to tell again if he's wearing stockings. Even though it's shaded in, you got to keep in mind they were out in the sun quite a bit, so it could be, the shading could be showing skin tone, or it could be showing stockings. And once more on the ground is a Buccaneer gun. Now, as a contrast, this is an image from S.K. Mellon. More than likely, going off of some of the images that we've seen already, this 1688 image was potentially based on sketches like we have seen. However, here we have the hunting smock without breeches at all. He's going barefoot. He's got something going on with his calf. The hat is actually a style from the time period. The militaries were wearing them. Some of the navies were issuing them, especially in the case of the English. And the Buccaneer gun, I mean, the butt on that, make any jokes you want. I'm not sure if that's a dog or a small lion. But these would have been the images that would have been reproduced. This sort of image would have been reproduced in books. It's where we get a lot of our pop culture image, starting in this time period. This is a later image from around 1700. It was printed by the Dutch. This is not an eyewitness image. Keep that in mind. But there's a lot of features which are in line with what we know are eyewitness images. If you notice the hat is what a lot of us who study this era tend to call the Peter the Great hat. Peter the Great actually had a very similar hat to this. It was knit. It's a knit hat that's designed to look like a felt hat. These appear in other Dutch images, possibly even some English images. They were popular. We have a short jacket with a lot of buttons. That was typical style of the time period. He's not wearing anything. He's not wearing a neck cloth. It appears he is wearing a baldric under his jacket. This appears in some other images. It wasn't out of fashion for the time. He's wearing open-kneed breeches and also wearing open-latched shoes. The sword's a little fanciful, but it is not out of the style. It's not too far removed from the style of the time period. The hilt looks very much like some of the hunting swords, which were common at the time. So, it's another one of these images that is inspired by the eyewitness accounts. Is it accurate compared to the last one? I'd say yes. Is it perfect? Certainly not. Now, with all of those prior images in mind, we come to somebody who certainly was not an eyewitness to the Buccaneers. Howard Pyle. Now, I cannot really say anything bad about Howard Pyle when it comes to depicting pirates, because a lot of his images have inspired generations of people who are interested in the time period. That said, let's try to figure out what is right and what is wrong. Start with the hat. The hat's pretty good. The hair length is good. The little mustache is also correct. Then we get to the it almost looks like it was what we would call a Jaeger rifle. It's a shorter barreled hunting rifle. Now, were these available in the time period? Yeah. Well, the form that we call a Jaeger rifle dates back into what we think of as the Renaissance. Would Buccaneers have used them? From the images that we have and the descriptions, no. But were they around? Yes. I will give him a slight pass on this. It does look like a later, possibly a Baker-style rifle, which would have been used in the Napoleonic era. But we're going to pretend I don't think that's what it is. Then we get to the baldric. Buckles in this time do not tend to be that large. Some of the French-style baldrics were a little bit wider, and of course they had a wider buckle. Tended to be thin, but of a similar form from the other buckles we've looked at in past videos. He's got some sort of a pouch tied off at his neck. There are some images of pouches on straps. So, even though we don't see them in the Buccaneer images, is it possible? Yeah. I'll give that one a pass as well. I'm being a little too generous, I think, but the shirt being worn open like that, from experience in the heat and also the way those buttons work or don't work, yeah, that's another thing I will give a pass. The collar, I'm going to say the verdict is out on, because again, we've recently started coming across images of and actual artifacts of collars in this time period that were wider than what we typically think of as the 1-inch norm. The cape, I mean, if he just traded for a piece of red fabric, it's very possible. I can't tell if that's his sleeves that have gone ragged, or if that's just a rag hanging off his other arm. He doesn't have a sleeve, so I'm not too sure about that. The gold bracelet. If a pirate had acquired jewelry and they wanted to keep it on their person so it wouldn't get stolen or lost, again, that's not out of the realm of possibility. The large waist belt is, in fact, out of the realm of possibility, as granted, they could have very easily made one, but buckles typically weren't available of that size for that. Pistol's not bad. It looks like a Miguel lock, which would have been popular with the Spanish at this time. The pistol is pretty spot on to what would have been available. I'm going to call them harem pants. They're not quite like the breeches that we see at this time period. There's some earlier styles, but again, those weren't worn as high up as these are. Some did have buttons going down the side, but if you notice how tight the ankles are, these are, I mean, without the buttons, these would fit in with some of the modern cyberpunk sorts of clothing styles. Pyle will not get a pass on that. And then we come to, probably, when it comes to footwear, one of the biggest disservices Pyle has done for those of us who study and try to recreate the clothing of the time period. Sandals were not a thing among European pirates or buccaneers. Did they exist? Yes. Did they look like that? No. Would a buccaneer have worn them if he had the chance to? Possibly, but there's no documentation to confirm that at all. If you want to recreate a historically accurate pirate, please do not wear sandals. Now, I skipped the sash. I skipped the sash for a very important reason. French and Dutch sailors at this time tended to wear sashes as part of their style. English, you don't see it quite as much, if at all, but among the French and the Dutch, it was done. Pirate interpreters, whether they be depicting fantasy pirates or depicting actual pirates, tend to overdo sashes. At some point in time, I will do a video on specifically French and Dutch fashions in this time period, just so I can give you that, well, if you're going to wear that, well, maybe you should wear this as well. I still love this image. I love a lot of Pyle's art, but understand Pyle was working in the early 20th century, well past the golden age of piracy. A lot of the images that he had to work with were other fanciful images, as well as some of the prints from Esquemelin and other books where it wasn't necessarily made by an eyewitness. Some of the descriptions and the books, of course, were from eyewitnesses, but the artists who did the work for it were not eyewitnesses. If you notice on the side, there is a pirate with, looks to be a bandana. Bandanas were worn in this time period in the Caribbean. Oftentimes they were worn in place of a wig. So you would actually have a hat over top of it. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were referenced in a trial document as wearing bandanas or headscarves. They were also a style among slaves, but you don't really see that in the images among sailors. We don't see the rest of the guy, we don't see what he has, so he might be an upper class guy or wants to be upper class, who's just trying to keep up with the style. Do I think I think it would be correct? No. Actually, looking at his bandana, now looking at the sword is actually not half bad. The hilt, you can't tell what sort of blade it has, but the hilt is very much in the style of the late 17th century. So, overall, the image is not awful. But again, this was done well after the golden age of piracy. And by default, well after the Buccaneer age. So that concludes the video for today. I'm shooting this probably the day the video is actually going to be released, if not the day before. The video itself was shot last week, and then I got a bit of a head cold, and I just was down for the count. If you enjoyed it, like, share, subscribe. We're trying to get the channel to grow a lot more. If you are interested in getting involved in this time period, whether it be Buccaneer in the 1670s, 80s, or pirate, merchant, etc. in the later 17th century, early 18th century, if you want somebody to make stuff for you, feel free to hit me up. Just go to our group Facebook page at the Crew the Fancy. So take care. Have an awesome week. This coming weekend we're planning on getting some fishing done, if not some cooking. So video next week will be a lot more like live outside. So take care. Catch y'all later.